everyone, welcome to another one of our Odinism videos in which we will be examining the religion as compared to Christianity and seeing which one is more testable and valid as a belief system. Today we're going to be examining the creation accounts, the one given to us in Genesis in the Bible and the one given to us in the Eddas about Odinism's views of our origins. In the Lays of the Gods, or Voluspo, a wise woman is summoned by Odin through necromancy to explain to him the main book of prophecy in the Eddas. For those familiar with religious texts, prophecy or prophets are referring to spokesmen. Who that person is speaking for is often the key in what makes these prophecies unique. Prophecy spoken from God or the gods is spoken from a perspective that goes beyond time and space. Thus, past, present, and future are basically side details when considering these things. We see this demonstrated in the Old Testament in Isaiah through Malachi, and the New Testament in Revelation, and on an individual basis through the prophets that have come and gone throughout Israel's history, referring to the Bible, as well as Voluspo, which is in this category. It speaks of the origin of the universe and the infamous fate of the gods. It tells how the world came to be, as well as the new world that will come when this one passes away. And also note that in Vafthrûdnismál, the Ballad of Vafthrûdnir, to fill in the details, we have all of Odinism's claims about the origin of the universe through the authority of prophecy. And in order to test these things, in order to test any of these claims, there are a number of things we should do as well as things we shouldn't do. First and foremost, we shouldn't hold one to the standards of the other. When the Bible sets standards for itself, that's according to 14th century BC Jews, and I wouldn't expect them to write the same way as 10th century AD Nords. There's almost 2,500 years of history between them, as well as definitive cultural lines. So how they define and test prophecy should be taken into consideration. Likewise, we shouldn't condemn them for making supernatural or beyond natural claims. If your standards throw out everything you're trying to test, you need to find a better standard if you want to come to any worthwhile conclusion about the topic. And finally, we should test the spokesman to see if they are not only hearing from a divine authority, but could be trusted to relay that information accurately. I think this is a universal standard. This pits the creation account of Moses, as well as Jesus, in the Old and New Testament, against the creation account of Vulva and Vafthrûdnir, as reported by Odin. So, starting with Odin's oral tradition given to us in the Eddas, the spokesman, their source, and their credibility will be tested in both of these standards. The first standard to test, obviously, the spokesman who spoke to Odin was named Vulva, and according to translators, the name could just be a title referring to a wise woman. Whether this is the case or not, we aren't told anything more of her identity apart from the fact that she was a dead giant. What reasons that would give for Odin to come to her for information about things she never saw is unknown. Some theorize that the inhabitants of Hell know the future, by the way, lower or H-E-L, it's just referring to the underworld. But there's no way of testing that without assuming our conclusion. For example, to make the statement, how do we know the dead know the future? Well, a dead woman in the Eddas knew the future. How do we know that is in fact the case? Well, because the dead know the future. How do we know that? A dead woman in the Eddas knew the future. It's circular logic that doesn't go anywhere. So all we can say is that she's a dead lady that was asked questions by Odin. Her sources aren't given in the Eddas, so there's no reason to trust what she had to say about creation, since she wasn't there to see it. Nor was her source, since A, this isn't mentioned, and B, it would have been the creator to know whether or not how the creation happened. And obviously Vulva and Ymir are two different individuals. Finally, noting as well our second source to verify some of Vulva's claims, Vafthrûdnir and Odin are going to both be included in the prophets category. Vafthrûdnir was a wise giant who was questioned by Odin, and Odin, as we hopefully know, is the Allfather, who was asked a series of questions that apparently he knew the answers to, since it was meant to be a challenge of who was the wiser of the two. The Ballad of Vafthrûdnir is a series of 12 questions regarding history, 5 about the future, and 1 about something he personally whispered to Baldur's corpse before cremating it. Since Vafthrûdnir couldn't answer that question, his credibility was made secondary to Odin's. And note, this is a valid point. Since Vafthrûdnir couldn't claim all knowledge, that would be limited to what he whispered to Baldur, and he succeeded to Odin as the wiser of the two. But note, that means that he now doesn't have the credibility to declare prophecy in a divine sense. However, since Odin can't claim that either, since he's pursuing wisdom, he can't confirm the creation of the universe since he wasn't there either. So now that we know how seriously to take their claims, here they are. In Völuspá, verses 3 through 5. Of old was the age when Ymir lived. Sea nor cool waves nor sand were there. Earth had not been, nor heaven above, but a yawning gap, and grass nowhere. Then Bur's sons lifted the level land. Mithgarth the mighty there they made. The sun from the south warmed the stones of the earth, and green was the ground with growing leeks. The sun, the sister of the moon from the south, her right hand was cast. Over heaven's rim no knowledge she had, where her home should be. The moon knew not what might was his. The stars knew not where their stations were. So that is the creation account of Odinism. Also, this is clarified for us in Vafthrûdnismál verses 20 through 21. Odin asks, "First answer me well if thy wisdom avails, and thou knowest it, Vafthrûdnir now. In earliest time, whence came the earth, or the sky, thou giant sage?" This is referencing Völuspá, obviously. Vafthrûdnir answers, "Out of Ymir's flesh was fashioned the earth, and the mountains were made of his bones. The sky from the frost cold, giant skull, and the ocean out of his blood." And with further details given in the Pros Eddas, Muspel and Nilfhelm were what were met in Guingigap, the yawning gap referenced in Völuspá, to produce Ymir. His sweat produced the giants, who were licked out by a cow named Adhulma that Ymir needed the milk of for nourishment, so you can't say that Ymir is an all-sufficient being either. She licked out Bor, who produced Odin with Bestla, the mother of Odin, and Odin killed Ymir to make the world. His brains are the clouds, his skull is the sky, and everything else is found in the Eddas itself. Now, how seriously should we take all of this? Before you get into, oh, that sounds ridiculous, my sensibility, we're not testing it according to what sounds right to us. We're testing it according to the sources. And we should take this about as seriously as we can take their sources. Since Odin went to a dead woman to get information about things that took place before he was born, and Vulva herself wasn't around before or even the same time as Ymir, we can't, at least not in a prophetic sense. So going on to the Old Testament, who is the main spokesman, his source, and their credibility? Well, Moses, according to the Old Testament itself, Jewish tradition in the Talmud, and credible historians that knew the difference between myth and history, like Josephus, they mention him as a flesh and blood human being. His name, Moishe, is Egyptian, meaning to be drawn out of water. And even though he was biologically Hebrew, his upbringing matches what's recorded for us in Exodus 2:11 all the way to Deuteronomy chapter 34 and verse 4. These are the accounts he had the cognizance to report himself. He was a direct eyewitness to everything he wrote down as Jewish history. This is what's known as the Torah. And however, since we're not testing Exodus through Deuteronomy, but Genesis, what Moses himself did not witness, you have to ask, what historical credibility did Moses have to report the origins of the universe, since he is also credited as a physical author, or rather the physical author of Genesis, according to Exodus 24 and verse 4. While he wasn't an eyewitness of creation, he did interview one. In Exodus 24 and verse 12 we read, Then the Lord said to Moses, Come up to me on the mountain and be there. And I will give you tablets of stone, and the law and the commandments which I have written, that you may teach them. Now note, this wasn't just the 10 commandments. In fact, this wasn't just the 614 commandments that followed. This was the entirety of Genesis through, I believe, Leviticus. So, noting personal opinions, about the validity of this claim aside, remember that I allowed the existence of the Azir and anything called God to exist so long as we could test the claim when given at face value. Vulva herself was not mentioned as a goddess, present before the time of Ymir to verify Vafthrûdnir or Odin's claims, or associated with the primary, lesser, or greater Eddas. The Torah, which is law in Hebrew, included at this time the entirety of Genesis and Leviticus, as well as the portions of Exodus that had been witnessed as history up until this point. The completion of the Torah is dated to the 14th century BC, and our earliest copy in the 3rd century BC in the Dead Sea Scrolls, with a trail written, noting that transmission, all the way to the 9th century AD in the Masoretic text, can be given at face value. Now, who does Moses' credibility ultimately fall on? Well, in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1, it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." The historical claims of this universe's origins in the Eddas do not fall on Odin, but Vulva historically. Since she wasn't able to directly verify with the eyewitnesses, or was one herself, Moses' credibility, according to the same standards, applied to the Eddas and stands from a far more secure position. Moses received his creation account from the only eyewitness available at the moment of creation, the Creator himself, not according to extrapolation, but direct reference of sources and methods according to the text. But note that the God of the Old Testament is going to either stand or fall on his own credibility. Anyone can make the claim. Do we have any other accounts that would support Moses's, or do they all stand or fall on an individual basis? Well, that's why we go to the New Testament and also note another creation account who not only verified Moses's, but reiterated the same points. I'm of course referring to Jesus of Nazareth. According to the New Testament, the early church fathers, and even atheist skeptical scholars and historians, they would identify the person known as Jesus of Nazareth as the most verifiable historical figure of ancient history. Now, this is a far shot away from Vulva's historical credibility, but note this as well. With a common name and an even less prominent occupation, the life and teachings of this man have literally rocked the foundation of human history in ways that no man ever has before or since. From people hostile to his followers and message, Josephus mentions his execution during the governorship of Pontius Pilate, and that many claimed him to be the Jewish Messiah in Antiquities, book 18, section 3, verse 3. Tacitus, who was not a Christian, mentions his death by crucifixion during the reign of Emperor Tiberius in Annals, book 15, chapter 44. The same sources for Moses also mention Jesus in Jewish tradition, according to those who staged his trial, the Sanhedrin, in the first place. In Talmud Sanhedrin 67, it recalls that Jesus was executed by the Romans. Notice that all three of these hostile sources towards Jesus' followers acknowledge his death within the same century he existed. It's very hard to die if you were never born. Without a word from the Gospels, we can know beyond a reasonable doubt that he is as historical a figure as you and I are now. So moving on then to the Gospels, we have 4 eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life. Matthew, whose Jewish-born name was Levi, was one of the original apostles. John Mark, who was a follower of Simon Peter, who was an eyewitness to everything he reported. Luke, who was a follower of Paul and had direct access to all of the eyewitnesses of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And finally, John, who was one of the original apostles. These eyewitness accounts include records of Jesus' sermons and how he backed up these words with deeds, including healings, exorcisms, demonstrating power over nature, and even raising the dead. Of these words spoken in favor of Genesis, Jesus doubles down Moses' credibility by treating the creation account in Genesis as literal history. In Mark chapter 10 and verse 2 we read, "The Pharisees came and asked him, 'Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?'" This was involving the controversy circulating at the time between Shammai and Hillel's schools of thought, who was very liberal as opposed to being conservative. You could divorce your wife for any reason or only in the case of spousal infidelity. They wanted to get him on one or other side of this controversy, and they did this testing him. He answered and said to them, Jesus, what did Moses, treating him as if he was an actual figure, command you? They said, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and to dismiss her. Jesus answered and said to them, because of the hardness of your heart, he wrote you to this precept. But, pay careful attention to this, from the beginning of creation, God made them, male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let not man separate. This is further affirmed in Mark 13 and verse 19, where Jesus goes on to speak much in the future tense, but references the history of the earth as well. Mark 13 and verse 19, for in those days there will be tribulation, such as not been since the beginning of the creation which God created until this time, nor ever shall be. This affirms everything that Moses reported in Genesis 1 through 2 in the broadest sense possible. And note that I'm choosing to quote exclusively from Mark, since anti-theistic scholars claim that Mark is the earliest gospel. Now, whether that's the case or not, the point still stands. Jesus makes the point about marriage by referencing the historical action made by God to consciously and purposefully make humans, male and female, as Genesis records in chapter 1 and further details in chapter 2. Likewise, in the prediction of the future, Jesus references that a future event compared to a past event as a reference when things began by God creating it. Unless you want to throw out the concept of Ragnarok as an allegory, Jesus is making a statement about a literal event with Moses' credibility in mind. Likewise, the standards of marriage and divorce are based on what Moses wrote, according to Jesus himself. These are references Jesus not only makes to Moses in the Torah and the Gospels either. Luke 11:50 through 51 mentions Cain and Abel in Genesis chapter 4 as historical figures. John 5 verses 45 through 47 mentions Moses predicting his coming into the world. Matthew parallels every one of Luke's accounts, mentioning Genesis as history, and most importantly, Jesus in John 8:58 quotes the way God directly introduces himself to Moses in Exodus 3:14 as a reference to himself. Jesus claimed to be Moses' historical source. So in tandem, what do Moses and Jesus' views on creation give us? From nothing, an eternal, uncreated being caused the universe to come into existence with the purpose of it being inhabited. Ex nihilo, from nothing, God spoke the universe into existence. Now, how seriously should we take all of that? About as seriously as we can trust their sources. Since Moses directly went to the only eyewitness of creation and was told how he did it, and Jesus claimed to be that God through words and deeds, including but not limited to a historical resurrection from the dead, we can at least in a historical sense. If you're looking for a religion based on history, I can't recommend Odinism. If you want a God worth following, I recommend Jesus Christ. Thank you for your time. I look forward to the next time that we can talk about these things. And until then, God bless you.